Hi, everyone, and welcome today to our virtual Knowledge Days session. My name is Amanda Schmidt, and we are here today to talk about APIs and integrations for the non-technological. I was really excited to, and maybe a little intimidated to do this session. It looks like we have a few hundred people on today, and there were many. There's still the number's still creeping up and joining. So it seemed like there was a lot of interest in this session, and based on the work that I do, that's not that surprising to me. I think that APIs are something that we all are aware of, but oftentimes, if we're not programmers, if we don't really speak that coding language, we're not exactly sure how we can use them and what we might be able to do with that type of information. And that's really what I want to focus on today. So welcome. Thank you for joining. Thank you for taking your time to join with us today. Whether you're in the morning or in the afternoon, wherever you're joining from. My name is Amanda Schmidt. I am a customer success manager focusing on Alma institutions here at ILLiad-Side in North America. I'm based out of the Boston area, so if anyone else is here from New England, it is a glorious, beautiful day here. And I have my MLS from Simmons University or Simmons College back when I went there. My product knowledge is pretty broad. I've mostly worked with Alma throughout my 8 years at ILLiad-Side, but I also have a lot of experience working with Primo, Summon, and some with 360 services as well throughout my role as a customer success manager. So what I do is I mostly work with customers to make sure that they're getting value out of the products that they use, that they're happy and they're satisfied and they're able to do the work that they need to do. And so part of what I've learned as I've done this over the last few years is that APIs are something that maybe if you work at a large research university, if you have a library IT staff, you might be making very good use of them. But that there's also a lot that we can be doing with these APIs, with these integrations, even for smaller institutions or institutions mid-sized who don't have their own dedicated IT staff or who don't have librarians who are very comfortable with programming. And so that's really why I wanted to do this session. You know, it would have been nice to do it in LA, but I'll take the beautiful day here in the New England area. So our objectives and what we're going to talk about today is mostly, this is really focused on people who don't have a huge tech background. I will say that I don't have a huge technological background, although I am a librarian and I've worked with libraries and I speak some of this language. But we really wanted to say, you know, if you're someone who finds yourself shying away from any talk of APIs or integrations in Alma because you don't have that technical expertise, if you've wondered what you can do and what you can't do without a dedicated IT staff person. So we'll discuss the basics of how APIs work. I'll show you a few things that you might be able to set up with minimal technical knowledge, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what you might be able to do after that, depending on the level of support that you have. So by the end of this session, you'll be able to know or understand what an API is and how they can be used in Alma. And we're going to focus on 3 different APIs and integrations that any institution can utilize without a lot of technical expertise, and how you'll get started with each of those. And let's see. So a little bit of our agenda. We're going to start off talking about what APIs are, how you can use them. The 3 different APIs and integrations I'm going to focus on today are on real-time ordering, the automatic electronic holdings update, which utilizes APIs but is an integration, and the ILLiad-NCIP integration. That's the last one we'll talk about. And then we'll go on to talk a little bit more about some things that you might be able to see coming up in the future that I think would be very exciting for many of you. So to start off, we are going to talk about what is an API. So API stands for Application Programming Interface. And in very basic terms, APIs allow applications to communicate with one another. So ILLiad uses what we call web-based APIs or RESTful APIs that can return data in response to a request that's made by the client. In this case, our client is Alma. It's the web app in the browser on what you see on your screen. And as I was doing some research for this session, I came across really what I think is one of the best explanations that I've ever read about what an API is for someone, you know, who's not a computer science person. And it uses restaurants as an analogy. So that's how I'm going to talk about it today. So if you go into a restaurant as a customer, you cannot enter the kitchen. Um, you need to know what is available in the kitchen. You need to know the types of food that they have, and for that you have a menu. So that's when you go into a restaurant, you have a menu to look at. After you look at the menu, you can make an order to a waiter who passes that information to the kitchen and who will then deliver what you have asked for, if all goes well. The waiter can only deliver things that the kitchen can provide. So the question is, how does this relate to an API? Well, in this case, the waiter is the API. I'm someone, I'm a customer at the restaurant, I'm asking for a service. In other words, I am an API customer or a consumer. The menu is the documentation that explains what I can ask for from an API, what type of information. And the kitchen is, for example, a server or a database that holds a certain type of data, whatever the buyer has bought for the restaurant as ingredients, and what the chef has decided they will offer and what the cooks know how to prepare. So all of this information, me talking to the waiter, sending that information, communicating back to the kitchen, that's how an API works. That's how it sort of allows us to communicate and get information from that database, from that web server. So knowing that, we kind of have to ask, like, how can we use APIs in Alma? So what information is available? You can use APIs for really a lot of different things, and this is not at all inclusive of all of them, but you can use it to update or change information in Alma, thinking about bib records, user accounts, electronic resources. There's a lot more that you can access. You can use APIs to get to data from Alma and publish it someplace else. One example might be booking information if you use the booking functionality in Alma, pushing that out to another type of calendar system. That's another type of API. There are many, many, many more examples of things that you can use and sort of a multitude of reasons of how you can access APIs. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time going into all of those today, because I really want to focus on sort of the things and actions that you can take with what we're going to talk about. So the next thing that you would really want to look at is the developers network in the API console. The developers network is really a one-stop shop for librarians, developers, IT engineers to view documentation about the APIs and integrations related to all of the Ex Libris products. So it's not just focused on Alma, it has everything about all of our products and APIs that are available. You can read about successful integrations that other customers have done on the blog. You can ask questions. There's a forum where you can ask questions about things. And you can manage your own usage of Ex Libris APIs. While there is a wealth of information and documentation on using a multitude of APIs across many products, it can be kind of overwhelming for librarians who don't have expertise in programming. I know it certainly is for me at times. And really what we're going to focus on is how we can make use of some of those APIs and integrations without having to write your own program, because you do usually need something to interpret that API. But the things we're going to talk about today don't require that you write that. Just going back to the developers network for a minute, one part that you will need to access in order to do some of these integrations is the ability to create an API key and utilize the API console. All of the documentation and content is viewable without an account. You don't have to have an account to look at that information. And you can try out APIs for Alma in the API console without having an account. However, if you're already an Alma customer, your institution was provided credentials, specific institution credentials to the developers network, which allow you to create API keys and give you access to your institution's environment. This usually was shared during the implementation process. So if you aren't sure how to get access to your institution's levels, you should probably speak with someone who was part of that team who did your implementation project, usually a systems librarian or sort of someone in a management level would probably have access. If you don't for some reason, please feel free to reach out to Ex Libris support and say you don't know how to get access to this information or who in your library might have it, and we'd be happy to help you get to the right place and send you that information if no one in your library has access to it. I will also note that there was a presentation done at Knowledge Days last year with a lot more information specifically about the developers network, accessing APIs in the APIs console. I've included a link in the presentation here. And so I would really encourage anyone who's going to start to access maybe some of the most basic APIs and hasn't really spent any time in the developers network to take a look at that presentation. It's up on the Knowledge Center, and just kind of run through it. And it's really got some step-by-step information in there about specifically around things like creating an API key. We'll talk about it in very basic terms, but that's a full-length presentation that will bring you to more information. So I'm just going to take a quick pause. I want to check in on the chat and see if there's anything, any questions that came in. Some of these are just related to recordings from Knowledge Days from last year. Can I include a chat? Let's see if I can include that link. And I'm not sure I can include the link right now.
Hey, Amanda, I've got it. I'll post it in the chat.
Thank you. And there's another question. We'll have to, some of these I don't know off the top of my head. So if I don't answer your question, there's probably a lot that are coming in too. We'll definitely follow up with information afterwards. I see a couple and I'm not sure of those answers. So I'll have to follow up more.
Yeah, Amanda, I'm trying to look into some of those now while you're talking.
Great, thank you. The first thing that the first API that I want to talk about today is real-time ordering. And okay, so real-time ordering is an integration between Alma and library service providers. It uses standard acquisitions processes with APIs to make resources available more quickly and increase the efficiency of loading your orders in your bibliographic records. Right now, we have this integration with 3 different providers: Prasowitz, Gobi, and Oasis, YBP Gobi. So those are the 3. If you use those, any of those providers for your ordering, you'll be able to set up that integration with any of those providers. I wanted to talk a little bit about the workflow, how this works, what happens, and then we'll talk a little bit about the work that you would do to go in and actually set up this type of process. So the workflow, generally, the idea is that you are placing orders in the systems that your library services provider uses, and that information is then going to be sent via API to Alma. So the user, meaning a library staff user, would search for an item in the vendor system, place that item in the shopping cart or whatever the equivalent is in their system. The user would then verify the owning library, fund codes, any other relevant information. And this is all information that you provide during your setup of this API. At checkout, so when you're ready to check out, when you view your shopping cart and go through your information, the vendor will send the shopping cart data to Alma using an API that's called the Create PO Line API. So this information that would be used to create an order in Alma. Alma will validate the received PO line information, and it will attempt to match the bibliographic data using standard identifiers. If no match is found, Alma will create a brief bibliographic record for the order. Alma then will also respond back to the vendor with the newly created PO line number. The PO line is processed in Alma just like any other PO lines are processed. If it requires some kind of manual review, Alma will send it to the in-review task list. The vendor reference number is kept as part of the Alma PO line, and the Alma PO line number is also kept as part of the vendor order details. So these are the 2 pieces of data that are used between the 2. You can see in this kind of flowchart thing up on the screen right now, there's a little bit of more information. It particularly talks about the exact APIs and information that are used to pass this back and forth between different users. The main thing here is that this is probably the most API heavy of any of the integrations we're talking about today. And the reason I wanted to utilize this particular API to discuss with you is that it's one of the few APIs where you don't actually need to build the program yourself, because we have worked with these specific library service providers, with these vendors to set this up. The vendor has done the work on their end to make sure that their platform and their resources are able to accept the information that's coming from Alma. So effectively, they've built what you would normally need to build yourself. And so the work that you have to do is mostly around setting up some information in Alma. We'll talk about how you would do that, as well as getting a little bit of information out of the developers network and sending some information to the vendor. So this is the basic workflow. And the first thing that you need to do in order to utilize this API, to have this information be automatically created in Alma for you as you do the work in your vendor services platform, is you need to create an API key for the vendor. The way that you do this is you log into the developers network, and this is where you need to use your institution's login. You can have an institution's login, and I believe that there is a way for you to create individual accounts that also work back with that institutional login. That's something you can talk about with support if you need to understand how to do all of that. Oh, I do see a quick chat about how do we find out which vendors support real-time ordering. There is a list for that on the developers network. The 3 vendors that we currently have that set up with are Harasowitz, Gobi, if you're using YBP for ordering, and Oasis, which is a ProQuest ordering system. Okay, so you'll log into the developers network. You can see a little bit of information here about how to add or edit an API key. I went in and was sort of creating a fake one. There's more information in that that session from 2019, also on the much more specific steps of how to do this. It's a pretty simple process, though, where you just kind of control some information. So you log in, you use your institution's login, you go under, there's a section in the developers network called Build My APIs, Manage API Keys, and you get to a screen like this. And all you do is you click Add API Key. An API key, you might be asking, what is it? It can point to either a sandbox environment of Alma or a production environment. Each API key relates to one or more general areas in Alma, like analytics, acquisitions, configuration, courses, etc. In our specific example, we're going to be looking at acquisitions specific information. What this basically means is that when API keys are given to third-party vendors for integration purposes, your institution can control what is being accessed and if the data can only be retrieved, deleted, created, or updated. So really, this is a way for you to control what access a third party has to your data in Alma. That's what that key is. It's basically like a whole bunch of digits that you share with someone, and it controls, can they read, can they write, and so on. When you're specifically creating the API key for the Alma vendor, you'll see here, you end up defining an application with the name integration with X vendor, ProQuest, Gobi, whatever. In this specific case, we'll add one for an acquisition API that will have to have a read-write plan, meaning that the vendor can actually create and write information in Alma because they need to be able to create a PO line. And then the configuration API can be a read-only plan because they just need to see certain aspects of the configuration. You don't necessarily want them to update the configuration. There are APIs where you might want to update the configuration, but we're not talking about those. You can test APIs in the sandbox, so you can connect to your sandbox. The APIs are all free and accessible. These are some of the questions coming in. And we don't have, there's some questions about other vendors. You know, if there are particular vendors that I didn't mention, you can feel free, my email's at the end of this, you can feel free to reach out and we can check in and see, because I know that there are, you know, product management is always working and with other vendors to try and set up some of this information. It depends, you know, on what APIs they have available and what types of systems they're using, whether or not our APIs can connect with them. So this is how you would create the key. The other piece, one other thing when you're working with these keys or creating these API profiles, we do want to talk about adding what we call an API restriction profile to any APIs you're providing to a third-party vendor. This is sort of an additional layer of security. It limits the vendor's access to orders for a specific vendor code only. So if you're setting up an integration with Harasovitz, for example, and you have a Harasovitz vendor account in your Alma, this means that they cannot inadvertently change anything linked to any of your other vendor account codes. It also limits the vendor's access to a fund, and specifically if it will return information like a balance. I think everyone here can understand why you may not want a vendor to know what the balance is in a fund. So we really highly recommend adding this profile. It's a way of keeping your data, your information secure and safe. And there's more information in this link on the presentation, and this presentation, if it's not already on the Knowledge Center, will be there later today. I'm pretty sure it's already there. So that's that's really what you need to do for the API part. The next piece of this is configuring a few things in Alma. It's pretty straightforward. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about it because it's laid out in a lot of the documentation about how exactly, along with some of the conversations you need to have internally about decisions to make. But you have to make sure that you have a default metadata template configured. Most institutions at this point would, whether it's default as books or something like that. That's going to be for the creation of a bib record if there is not one to match on in your database already. You can do this from the metadata editor under the templates, and you just choose which one you want to define as your default, or to check which one is already defined as your default. You can see here we have one that's an RDA template. So the create new order API is mainly used for creating a PO line in Alma. That's what we do with this real-time ordering API. So the next thing that you would want to do is to new order API integration profile. A lot of what we're talking about today uses integration profiles, which are available under the configuration menu in Alma, under the external systems and in the general section. This really is where you put into an interface information that the API is going to use in order to create all this information, what it's going to look at, how it's going to decide about different rules that want to be applied. So as part of the PO line details, the relevant, we're looking at creating this create new order API to create the PO line. It's going to represent the order that was done in your vendor system. So as part of the PO line details, the detailed information that you have in the order line created in Alma, the relevant metadata needs to be sent to Alma. So they need to tell us all of that information that would normally be in a PO line that you manually create. Alma will try and match with existing bibliographic records. We need to look, you have to define what matching rules you might want to apply in that case. If a matching bibliographic record exists, the PO line will be related to that particular record. If not, it will create a new bibliographic record. So you can see, you'll set up the define new order API integration profile. You can integrate with multiple vendors, absolutely, but there's only one profile per institution. So you do sort of set that matching information, the matching rules, and those apply at all of the different vendors. You can see there's some link here to how the bibliographic record is determined, specific information about how we're matching and what your different options are. There's a few different configurations that you can set up. There's also validations for fund-related issues. Those can be documented. So what funds that information is coming out of, how you define that, basically like how your fund codes are mapping. And then, as I mentioned, also to define an API restriction profile, we highly recommend doing that as well. So that's the information that you have to fill out in Alma. You create that integration profile, you make sure that you have a default metadata template, and your API key. That's sort of the what you need to do on your side. However, there's also a lot of information that you'll need to provide to the vendor, because the vendor needs to know how to interpret the information that's coming out of Alma. So the library will need to set up these configurations in advance, and then provide the vendor with a set of information when they say, look, we're interested in setting up this API integration with Alma. here's the information that you need to do that. On the developers network, and I have links at the end of this presentation, there are specific information for each integration. So Horesovitz, Oasis, and Gobi might need different information, but this is the basic information. There might be a few other small things that they each need too. So this information, as I said, will help the vendor set up their side of the API to send the order information to Alma via the API and to receive that information that Alma sends back. Most of this information is really just to ensure that the vendor understands the library's vendor and fund codes. That's the vast majority of what is happening here. You know, every library has a different way of setting up vendor codes in Alma. They use different codes. You know, you don't all say PROQ for ProQuest. In your vendor code and your fund codes. Obviously, every library has very different fund codes. So the API key, that's probably one of the main things that you will have to send to every vendor because that controls their ability to connect with Alma via your API. The vendor code and vendor account name from the Alma vendor account. In the example I have up here on the screen, it's just a ProQuest account from my demo system. So you'll send them that code. As well as the account name that you're using. They'll need to know both. The other pieces of information you'll need to send are the owning library codes, the location codes. The owning library would be where you want the PO line assigned to. The location codes are going to be, this is only for physical materials, and this would be the location where the item information is going to be kept. And the fund codes, the fund information will come from. Someone did ask, where does it look for the match, the institution zone, the network zone? For those of you who are using, who are part of a consortial implementation where you have a network zone, you do have the ability to determine where that's looking. So when you read through the documentation, it specifically does talk about if you're using that type of environment, and there's like a radio button or something like that that you can choose when you set up the profile. Okay, so these are the things, the communication with the vendor. And that's the basic information. There's some more things you need to do. There's definitely testing that needs to happen once you have communicated all of this information. We usually encourage you to test in your sandbox environment to start out with, especially if you have a premium sandbox. That's a really great way to test. But you can also test in your live environment. If you don't have a premium sandbox, that's fine. You can test in your live environment. We have, there's a blog post up that I have a link to later at the end that talks about specifically the ways that you might want to test this. Usually it's going to involve you having some communication specifically with the vendor. So you'll need to create some kind of test order in their environment to make sure that it's creating it in Alma, and they'll need to know that that's not actually a real order. If you have specific questions about how to do that testing, feel free to reach out to us either via support. I'm always happy to direct you, depending on what region you're in, a person internally within Ex Libris who might be able to help you setting up some of this. And I saw a question in the chat that came through just very briefly asking about why you would want to do this. And this is the fun part where I get to talk about why this is good. So some of the basics of real-time ordering and why you would want to do this, why you would want to set this up, is that it is real-time. It shortens the amount of time that you have for an order to be created in Alma. If I am using, if I create an order in Oasis and I have that information in Oasis, that order will show up in my Alma instance within a few minutes, as opposed to my other options might be I could load embedded order data or EOCR records coming from my vendor. That's going to take minimum a day. You might be loading them daily, depending on how often you order. You might only be loading them weekly. So you might create those orders and need to wait until that information shows up in Alma. So you'll have a better sense of your fund balance, especially if you're ordering from multiple users. You have a more real-time information. It also makes those records available to your end users. If you're making it, if you're allowing them to see things that are on order, then they can see much sooner when things are going to be available to them, that there is something, that this particular resource is on order. It saves acquisition staff time. This is really a big one, either from double entering orders in Alma and another system. And there's no need to download, upload files or create and maintain import profiles. You obviously need to create and maintain the integration profile, but it's not something that you need to be checking on an as regular basis. The other reason is this is it's a good, I like to think of it as like an entry-level API. It really is using APIs. Some of the other things we're talking about are a little more borderline APIs integrations. And this really is a lot of real-time information being passed back and forth. And it's usually once you set it up, as long as the records are being created, you might want to be checking how things are matching on a regular basis, but there's not too much else that you need to do from that perspective. I'm going to take a quick break just to look through some of the questions right now specifically on real-time ordering, and then we'll move on to our next section. So I see, do vendors charge for this service? We do not charge for any of our APIs. As far as I know, the vendors listed on there do not either. But you would definitely want to check with the provider. But as far as I've heard, none of those from those 3 vendors require any additional fees. How do we find that blog post? I think this might be the one about testing. I'm going to have a link to all of the documentation that I reference at the end of this. Some of them are embedded in some of the other posts. If there's anything that you can't find, feel free to reach out to us afterwards. I'm going to go through and make sure that everything I've referenced is linked at the end, just to make sure. But I have a whole bunch of links at the end of this that all have referenced, and then some also that are embedded in the session. Let's see. Checking some of these. Someone asked if the owning library needs to be the one associated with the location. The owning library is for the order, and then you can indicate the location that it would be created in for the order purpose. So if you have your orders all default to like a main location or a stacks location or something like that, and then you're still going to receive these items, assuming they're physical materials because they have a location. They're going to be received into Alma, and you would use your normal processes if you're going to put those into a different location than you would otherwise. It says, another question is, if you have multiple libraries in an institution, you can only set up one API integration for OASIS. Provide the vendor with different vendor and fund codes to ensure that orders from one library are not attributed to another library in the institution. That is exactly correct. You will give them all of the fund information and vendor information to make sure that maps correctly, because they should have that understanding from their end as well. Usually in the system that you're using, there's a way to do that. I also see some questions about people who have been working for a while to get this integration up and running. This is particularly in North America, but what is the best way to engage the right people on the ProQuest Ex Libris side to get this working? That is one way. I assume that you've been working with the support organization, that there are, without knowing the specifics of the case, there might be some development issues going on. Especially if you're in North America, feel free to reach out to me directly. I work in the customer success part of the organization, and a lot of what we do is kind of partner with institutions. I work specifically with the libraries in the eastern half of the US, but feel free to reach out. My email's at the end of that, and I can try and put you in touch with someone internally if it's not me that would be able to kind of maybe help take this to the next level and push things through if it's getting stuck based on some things that are happening. So someone also asked if we know why just those 3 vendors. If we do we know if other vendors have APIs in the works? I think we have tried with other vendors. I don't know the specifics of that. You know, I can try and find some more information if there are any that are in the works. I think some of it is the vendors being willing to take that information and do the development on their side to see, you know, they have to know that there's a demand from their users. So one thing you can do is to talk to the vendors that you're working with who are not on that list to see if this is something that they're interested in doing. I can also look and see if there's any more information on other vendors that we might be in the process of working with on this. Okay, there's some more questions coming in. I want to make sure that we have time to get to everything else because we're about 20 minutes, 25 minutes left. So if your question wasn't answered, I'm sorry. We'll try and follow up with you and provide more information later. The next thing I wanted to talk about is the automatic electronic holdings uploads. This is really more of an integration, although it can at times utilize APIs to communicate between the 2 different vendors. The Auto Electronic Holdings Update. What is it? What does it do? It enables institutions to automatically update electronic holdings from specific information providers. So what does this mean? It means it can ease the library management of your electronic holdings. It can automatically activate specific electronic holdings. So in Alma speak, we can talk about it automatically activating portfolios, specific portfolios in a collection. It can update electronic holdings. So if coverage information changes, if you have this turned on already, it can make sure that as the vendor makes changes to what is available, that information is automatically updated in Alma. Now, this happens a lot with a lot of community zone collections. You have this information already, right? So you might have it's set to activate new portfolios when they're added to collections or update or use the community zone holdings. But there are also a lot of providers and a lot of collections that are very institution specific. One that always comes to mind is Science Direct as a package that the holding information is different depending on when you signed up for it, depending on what kind of profile you have set up with Elsevier. And there are also, other vendors that have collections like this specifically. So without this automatic holdings update or holdings information, you have to do a lot more work to get that information correct. You need to have some kind of file that you can upload that has all of the specific portfolios. You need to know that they're going to match, or you're going to have to manage it locally, and you're going to, on a regular basis, have to make sure that these changes are getting put into place so that your users are not hitting broken links for something that won't work, finding information that looks like you should have it, but your coverage is incorrect. There are lots of these different things that happen, particularly in an environment like we're in today, where so much more of the learning that's happening is going to be done online. Where we're unsure of what things will look like when students are back in the fall, whether they'll be physically there or not. Having the relevant information available to your library is very important, making sure that users can find what they're looking for. This is currently supported with ProQuest eBook Central, Ovid, Springer, and Elsevier. Those are the 4 vendors that we have this type of holdings information. I know I've heard from many people that they would love to see more. And so again, like anything else, I would encourage you to work with the vendor that you are that you would like to have this holdings information set up with, as well as requesting either through the Ideas Exchange or through other channels to make sure that Ex Libris is also adding more of those. Right now, these are the 4 providers that we have this set up with. There are other ways through loading files or things to have holdings set from other vendors, and so you can always open a support case to ask about that specifically. Are the bib records associated with the auto load collection's full bib records or the brief bibs that we often see with the community zone records? These are connected to, you do have to be using a community zone collection for these specific, that's how it's going to turn things off and on. So it is associated with the community zone. The question is then is how does it work? So what is it using? What kind of information is it looking at? Basically, the vendor supplies a holdings file in usually a KBART format. KBART, for anyone who doesn't know, it stands for Knowledge Bases and Related Tools. It's a NISO recommended practice to facilitate the transfer of holdings metadata from content providers to knowledge-based suppliers and libraries. So basically, it's a standardized format for holdings information. The next thing that you would have to do is there's a specific, for each one of these, there's a specific collection in the community zone that you need to activate, and it's separate from some of the other collections. It's usually a specific one for the e-holdings update. Each one of these electronic holdings updates has its own documentation on it, so it tells you, from there you can see the exact collection that you need to have turned up in the community zone. And then you create an integration profile for each vendor. So again, as we looked at with the real-time ordering API, from the sort of external systems part of the Alma configuration, it's where you create all kinds of integration profiles. You can also create one for electronic holdings update. The vendor then will connect to Alma, usually via an API, to automatically send that holdings file on a regular basis. So there's some information you put into that profile about your institution. There's usually some kind of code or key you need to get from the vendor specifically to help identify who you are when they're having that connection. So you usually will need to reach out to Elsevier or ProQuest or whoever to get that information. And really the key thing here is that there's no loading of files. You don't have to maintain something on a regular basis to load that information. This may not be an integration that's for everybody. It may not be something that you use for all of your vendors, but especially for institutions where that kind of loading and maintaining of information is a big bulk of their staff time, having things available and automatically set up, especially when you're looking at something like Science Direct that's so specific to your institution, that information is really, really important. I know there are always some concerns about the quality of community zone records, and again, that is something that we routinely are working on to make sure that they are more complete and as complete as we can make them. So let's see, let me just check on the questions here. Scroll up for a second. There are some questions about having the integrations, people who are having problems setting up the integrations properly. They're getting error information. If you have, it sounds like some people have support requests. Absolutely, if you have not heard back, in the support case, ask for an update. It is just ask for an update. I'll put my emails out there if you need some help or just getting in touch with the right person. I'm really happy to help for anyone who's been having those issues. I can put you in touch regionally. If you're not in North America, I can put you in touch with the relevant people in Europe or APAC who might be able to help you as well getting that information set up, because we do. I think that these are a great resource for libraries, and they're really important and useful for you. And we want to make sure that those integrations are working, especially with the vendors that we've already set things up with. Sometimes it's just a little tweak and it just requires a little bit of back and forth and maybe a little pushing on a support case to get some information. Let's see. Let's see some comments about the records. Yeah, the bulk of the records, at least for ProQuest eBooks, are pretty robust. Is the auto update API only for the individual institution, or is it implemented at the consortial level? I think this probably applies to questions to network zone implementations. I'll have to double check on that. I'm not actually sure. A couple of people asked about that specifically. Oh, and thank you for putting my email in there. And how does an institution access bib records in the community zone? you should be able to search for them in the specific collection, and then you can actually see the bibliographic record associated with those collections by clicking on the title. Okay, so I think I saw most of them, but there's probably some I didn't answer. We'll definitely go back through the chat and see if there's more that we didn't get to, and we'll make sure that we follow up with you on those. So the last thing I want to talk about in the 15 minutes we have left is the ILLiad-NCIP integration. And we'll kind of go through this one pretty quickly. This is a little bit more involved in some of the things that you need to set up. I would encourage you to reach out to support or to your customer success representative if you know who they are, or get in touch with me and I can tell you who they are if this is something that you're looking to set up. There are a few more things that you can do, although I will say that the institutions personally that I've worked with on this have been able to set this up pretty quickly. You know, it's some configuration and some making sure that you have all of the right information, you know, formatted in the right way. But it is something that, especially if you're using ILLiad, can be a huge benefit to you. So the Alma-ILLiad-NCIP protocols were developed by members of the XLMS community to tie the two systems together, originally with Aleph actually and ILLiad, and to reduce the amount of processing and ILL materials by pushing data from one system to the other. It uses NCIP, which is the NISO Circulation Interchange Protocol, so it's a standard for passing information used mostly with resource sharing systems, but it was also the basis for the SIP protocol that's used for self-checkout machines. It basically ties together the two systems and reduces the amount of processing of ILL materials by pushing data from one system to the other. Generally, what you're going to do is you're going to manage most of your information in ILLiad, and it's going to push certain information to Alma so that you can also have your users track that information about things that they've borrowed. So there are minimal configuration changes that have to be implemented in Alma. There is some work that you'll have to do, mostly around setting up some of the fulfillment rules and such. It also requires some downloading files from ILLiad, from Atlas systems in particular, and adding them to each workstation where they will be used. So there is something that you need to install on a particular either desktop or laptop station where you will be processing materials from ILLiad. The setup process does not take very long, and your workflows can continue as usual during the setup. Sorry, I'm just seeing a question that came through. I think I'll follow up with those at the end. So this is kind of, I put this in here as a general workflow so that you can see how things are going to work in Alma, but generally you have a patron who will file a request for information, ILLiad form. The borrowing request is created, and if you see broker system, we're talking about ILLiad specifically here. ILLiad's going to request availability from other institutions, find out whether the information is available. If Alma is the lender, it will be sending that information to Alma to check. If Alma is the borrower, doesn't come into play quite yet. So that information, that's primarily all still happening in ILLiad. The main difference is going to be if a lending request is then created, it's going to push information to Alma in order to say, manage this through your resource sharing library, and you have this information that you need to pull through the fulfillment process. So it creates that information and that request in Alma as well, so that your resource sharing staff can manage the availability in particular of that information, of that resource, and know whether or not it's checked out. So then the broker system will communicate with a potential supplier, find that information, a lending request can be created. If this is a borrowing request, it will, check in ILLiad, it'll find someone to supply that to you, and the item will be shipped. And the process that happens then is when that item is brought in and checked in ILLiad to say this is available for the patron, it's going to push information to Alma to say, create a temporary Bibbin item basically for this particular resource so that we can check it out to the patron. For the patron, one of the main benefits in this case is that the item actually gets checked out in Alma, and so they can see all of their ILL materials and their regular materials from their account in Primo or in Summon in one place without also having to go into ILLiad to check for it. And it allows the library to sort of have a handle over what is used. How this really works in each specific borrowing workflow. So you would receive items via ILLiad. You would check them out to patrons in Alma. Then you would check them back in through ILLiad. So ILLiad will create an NCIP request with a borrower ID and a brief record, and it will appear as a request in the borrower's account in Alma and Primo. The item due date will come from ILLiad. And then optionally, you have the ability to batch process notices through ILLiad or send them via Alma through if you do like an additional check-in. So that's the basic borrowing workflow of how that happens. On the lending side, the library will receive an item that they're lending out, or they'll scan library-owned items in ILLiad. Returned items are then also received in ILLiad when it's brought back to your library after being lent to someone, and it's checked into Alma to reshelve. So ILLiad will update Alma to move the item from its home location, from being on the shelf and whatever its home location is, to the resource sharing library in Alma. Basically, what this tells you is that this item is no longer available on the shelf and it's out for resource sharing. In a lot of previous systems, we sort of would have kind of a dummy patron, like an ILL patron that we would check something out to. This is a similar functionality, but without actually checking the item out. It's just putting it in a temporary location of the resource sharing library effectively. So ILLiad will then also update Alma and mark the item as in transit to its home location once it's been checked back in. So the configuration that needs to happen at this point falls into basic categories. There's the library configuration, which primarily involves setting up the resource sharing locations. The fulfillment configuration, which is setting up the fulfillment unit and the rules around how items are going to be lent out. And then the partner configuration, which is setting up the proper ILL partners in Alma to make sure that you have all this information in there. So just kind of to go through this very, very basically, if there's anyone who's really looking to set this up, you can reach out and ask for us to kind of help you with more information, especially we do this work with the customer success department. I'd be happy to kind of help any libraries work through this process if they're really, really interested in setting this up. It's also something that the support team is able to kind of give you some basic information on it as well. And there are also a lot of resources linked to at the end of this presentation that go into this in much more detail. You'll need information on the user identifier type. This should match the user code in ILLiad, the default library owner, so what library where you receive the ILL requests, and then you need an open URL if you're defining this via GES or General Electronic Service. So you can see some of the information. This is the screen that you set up this profile in Alma. So you've got it's setting up partner information basically. You'll also have to set up information around the checkout item, accept item, and the automatic receive. These are the NCIP communications that are coming from ILLiad to Alma. So it's basically what's going to happen, what default location is it going in, what's the when an item is accepted, what location is created in, what library is it under? Is it under the resource sharing desk or a different desk that it's being received at? And then a few other things around like look up user communications if it's actually looking up a user or not. You'll need to set up a partner in Alma of a type NCIP with a system type of ILLiad. You'll need to make it active. This basically allows you to say that this is a partner that I work with, so this information can communicate between Alma and this other resource. It supports borrowing, it supports lending. If you have specific workflows you want to do, those are also set up, as well as a locate profile if this is interesting. I see a question around how this is different from a ROTA. This is basically if you're using a ROTA that's resource sharing within Alma. This would be for any libraries that are using ILLiad where you're managing all of your resources in ILLiad. Really, it's for the actual maintaining of the item that's being loaned or borrowed. So normally you would do that work in ILLiad. You would say, I'm checking out this item. And then you either, if you're sharing something with one of your patrons, if it's a borrowing request from one of your patrons, You might only track that in ILLiad. This would give you the ability without double entry to also have that information tracked in Alma. So you as the ILL staff have access to ILLiad, but a lot of the circulation staff may not always have access to that information. So it's one that you'll be able to check either place to see information about that item that's being lent to your patron. From the lending side, it allows you to see in Alma that something is being lent out specifically via ILLiad, so that if you need more information about the user that it's being loaned to, you know that it's in ILLiad. And that action all happens automatically. You do the work in ILLiad, you say, I'm loaning this particular book to this particular library. That information is then is also automatically real-time changed in Alma, so that you don't have to go in and also check it out in Alma. That's the main driver here, is that it decreases you can find information about those resources that you're borrowing or lending via ILLiad in both places, and you don't need to do double entry for it. And yes, this is mainly for physical materials. So the ILLiad-Side configuration primarily happens through add-ons. There are 3 add-ons that need to be configured for ILLiad. They come from Atlas Systems. You'll need to install them on each workstation. I'm not going to go through the specifics here in the interest of time about how you need to do that, because it's actually very well documented on how to install and configure the add-ons. If you're running into problems with that, please do let us know via support case. Reach out to me if your library needs some more assistance. You will need, this is the information that you will need. I'm not going to go through the specific because it differs for every library, but it's information about your particular instance of Alma put into this URL format. You need to know your Alma institution code, which if you don't, you can ask support, or really anyone that you work with from Exlibris can find that information for you. And then the code for the profile that you set up in Alma. So that's kind of the basics of the ILLiad integration profile. The sort of the thing that I wanted to end on is what's next. Like, what if this is something that your library has done, if you've done all 3 of those, or you work with Exlibris over the next few months to set up some of those various ones that make sense for your library, where might you be able to go after this? Are there other APIs that you can use, or what? A lot of this is based on what kind of IT support you have access to. You can see here on this like basic screenshot from the developers network that these are all of the areas where we have APIs available. So depending on what type of information you want to get to, there's a lot that you can do with APIs, but you will need some kind of assistance from someone who has a little bit of programming. There are some other integrations you can set up, and sometimes if you have some minimal access from IT, then you can do some of this work, because they can often do some of the coding around making sure that the APIs can be understood. And the last thing I wanted to talk about, which is something that has been, it's out there, but it's not publicized yet. So it's just kind of a little bit of a sneak peek, and there will be more information this summer. But we will be rolling out something that's called Cloud Apps. And I've learned more about this in the last couple of weeks, and I'm really excited for it, especially for a lot of the libraries that I work with. So Cloud Apps are ready to use add-ons, which will be used by staff users in conjunction with Alma. It's basically going to be something that's a simple UI. You'll see it alongside your other pages in Alma. It's going to show up on the right-hand panel, and these will be apps that you can just activate within Alma. Very little configuration or setup. Most of these will be created. Some of them are created by Exlibris. A lot of it is created by the community. So there's some that allow you to load users via CSV file, or to search for information in HathiTrust from within Alma just by activating a particular app. Please look out for more information coming probably this summer, maybe July, I think is around the time that I've heard. So this is really exciting. It utilizes APIs with like basically nothing that you as the library have to do, just turn something on. And so that's really, I think, kind of wanting to leave you with a little taste of something cool and exciting. Cloud Apps will not replace APIs. It's just a way for very technological people at other libraries to make their applications available to the wider Alma community in a way that is very easy to access. As far as what kind of program support you need from IT, it's generally it's going to be the level of programming. It depends on the program that they're going to have to create and the API specifically that you're going to have to use. Sometimes it's just the ability to pull information into Alma, and it's a simple Java or something like that. It really depends on what you want to do. If you're interested in doing some of that, please feel free to reach out, especially if I think most people are from North America or Europe. I can certainly put you in touch with the customer success person who works for your region. And you know, they might be able to point you in the right direction or provide you some more guidance around that area. And my email is in the chat again. It's also at the end of this presentation. It's basically amanda.schmidt@exlibrisgroup.com. We are, I think, yeah, oh, we're, sorry, 1 minute over. I've got a bunch of links here at the end for documentation, things that we've talked about. I think I'm going to add a couple more to these and send an updated presentation to be up on the Knowledge Center in a day or so. But everything I've talked about is at least linked to also from these links here. And then there's my email. And I've kind of been going through questions as we go. I know that there's some that we haven't answered, and we will make sure to follow up either with individually or send something out with answering some of those questions. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you to all of you who joined. We hope we'll see you at some of the other sessions, and definitely take advantage of the links where we've got all of the previous recordings. And like Amanda said, we'll go ahead and update this presentation. If you check back early next week, it'll be there by Monday, I think is a safe bet. All right, thank you all kindly, and have a great day.